All right, everyone, here we go. Here we go. You can tell Lisa's getting slap happy because I'm starting to get a little loose. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another amazing session here at ShiftED Summer Summit. We are just so excited that you're all choosing to spend your time with us today. So we are in the middle of our teaching theme day. We've had two fantastic panels already, and now we're going to roll right into a third, and I'm super excited about it. At the last panel, I did forget to publicly thank our two community volunteers one more time. So that was Brian Perry and Andrea Cardinal. So thanks to them, if they hear this, thank you so much for an awesome job that you did there. I'm especially thankful because we don't have a community volunteer for this particular session, but don't worry, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. But a couple housekeeping things really quickly. Per usual, we are recording the session, so it will be available to everybody long-term up on our YouTube channel. But if you do not want to be a part of that recording, this is your chance to kind of get out of that. Also note that the closed captioning does work. So if you find that useful to you as you're kind of watching the session, please do turn that on. Also know that we're going to make all the chat content available to everyone as well. So links that get shared there, thoughts that get shared there, we will be publishing those out as part of our proceedings from ShiftED. So you will have the chance to kind of get that content. You can always, of course, save your chat as well if you want to. So please do note that there's one more session after this one at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So in about 3 hours from now, we'll be having a listening session with Lisa Hammershame, who is amazing. She's a researcher, a designer, an educator, and she's going to be conducting a session where she just wants to hear from everybody about what we've learned from all this online teaching we've been doing. Have we changed our thoughts? So do come join us for that. But for now, what we have is a fantastic panel session that has been organized for us by the amazing Christina Carrasquilla from Arizona State University. And she's going to lead us in her session called Nurturing Student Success, Shifted Strategies and New Modalities, with 3 other fantastic panelists. So Christina, please take it away.
Well, hello, welcome. I was going to say good morning, but it's morning here in AZ, East Coast. Good afternoon, good wherever you are. I hope that you're having a great day and you've been enjoying these amazing sessions. I know they breathe new life into my teaching, and I especially need that moving into the fall semester, this semester in particular. So many challenges we're facing. So I'm super happy to be here with a most amazing panel that I have assembled from all of the people I secretly admire. And that's how I love this. It's like I can get together. I'm like, you know who I want to hear from? I want to hear from so-and-so and their thoughts. So I'd like to welcome them now. We are, of course, nurturing student success, shifted strategies and new modalities. You are absolutely welcome to ask questions throughout. We'll have a Q&A via the slides there. And if one of the moderators could take that link and paste it, that would be amazing because I have 3 screens and don't know what I'm doing. I like to sing when I'm nervous. All right, so I will be moderating this panel. I've assembled the superstars, Sarah Rutherford from Cleveland State University, Vinicius Lima from Grand Valley State University, and Hugo Escalante Almazan from Tecnólogico de Monterrey. Thank you so much, you amazing, amazing people, for being here and sharing your thoughts. The presenter notes are on the screen. Thanks, Sarah. That's cool. I'll definitely be fixing that as we move into our first topic. So what we've done here is made a space where we can talk about student success. Each one of our panelists is going to present kind of one aspect of that. And throughout each of those talks, there's going to be absolute discussion with our audience. So if you have questions you'd like to pose, put those in the Q&A. And if our panelist is asking a question, please go ahead and answer those through the chat, and I will be sort of relaying those to our speaker. So let's get started with fostering agency with Sarah Rutherford. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everybody. I actually want to start with a question for you all. And if you could put your answers into the chat, what does the phrase student success mean to you? So just what, like top of mind, what comes to your head when I say the phrase student success?
Gary says helping a student reach a goal. Mina says my administration requires it. They require success. There's no roadmap though. Yeah.
Mhm.
Getting a job, feeling empowered, students feeling empowered.
Yeah, Prescott, you're on the nose of where I'm going in this presentation. Yeah. Mhm.
Prescott says not just passing the class, but actually absorbing the material and or learning the skills. That's been a big change for me during the pandemic. It's not just pushing out the right things, it's really making sure they absorb it. Do they get this or don't they? Peter says successfully navigated the course.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of stuff around goal-oriented content, students feeling affirmed. And Christine, if you would go to the next slide. So when I think of student success, I'm sure our institutions would want us to frame it in one way, and we're framing it, from an educator perspective. There's the like keyword student success that our institutions would affiliate with kind of quantifiable information, things like retention, graduation rates, time to completion, GPA. And we know that there are individual stories behind all that, right? So all that stuff feels like very, this is not a part of my wheelhouse. I'm in the classroom. We know that that rate time to completion, we see some individual student stories behind some of those things. For the focus of this presentation around agency, I'm looking kind of where I think most of us feel our control is, and that's that student success being focused on the individual. So thinking about learning, engagement in the classroom, and student goals. Next slide. So when we're looking at this, thinking about some things that maybe make students feel like they don't have agency in the classroom, or agency in their lives. So Gen Z, which encompasses most of the students that we have in our classroom, they're really focused on kind of college as a means to an end. So it's my place to get a job. What I value is security after graduation. So they're less focused on kind of like, college as a growth experience. And so I've also seen in the classroom, maybe this resonates with you all, many students don't give a lot of thought as to why they're in our classroom, like why they're in your specific class. So, maybe you're teaching an elective, and so there's like an element of choice there with students. But often it's a requirement, right, for their major or minor. Yeah, maybe college is, I'm just here, it's what I'm supposed to do after high school. Thanks, Gary. So I'd love to know, this is another question for the chat. If you would go to the next slide, Christina. What behaviors have you seen from your students, or maybe even things have you heard that your students say that demonstrate that they feel a lack of agency in the classroom?
Do you ever hear this one in class? No, but how do I get the points? How do I get those points back? And it's like, well, it's not really about the points, is it? It's about learning it. Did you learn it? Well, how do I get the points?
Yeah, that should is, a dangerous word, I think, can be, what should I do? People pleasing. Yeah, getting stuck and not feeling like they can move around it.
Gary says involving their parents. Yikes. Does anyone hear from parents? I've never heard from a parent, thankfully.
And thanks, Lisa, for saying, like, sometimes that just looks like they don't come to our class anymore. You know, oof, man, I'm thinking of you people that hear from parents. And I think, Anne, that's a great point too. You know, many non-traditional students maybe, you know, paying for their classes out of their own pocket. They're taking huge kind of sacrifices to be in school. And so maybe they are more motivated or have more kind of mental control over why they're there.
I mean, it brings up a really good point. It's not legal for your parents to, you can't give them any information for laws and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love that word should. Oh, I don't love it, but I'm in making this point. Christine, if you would go to the next slide. So there's this, I think sometimes there's this have to mentality, like I have to be here. This is just, you know, this is, I met with my advisor, this is what they're telling me, this is the class I need to be in, so I'm here. You know, I'm shown up in the classroom. And I think have to or should really has this external locus of control. So it's feeling like, you know, control is not, it's held by someone outside. And really the focus of what we're looking at today is moving to an internal locus of control. So students really feeling like, I know why I'm in this class. I maybe, even if they don't want to be there, at least understanding the value of maybe what that particular classroom environment would hold. So before I move into some things that we can start looking at, I have two questions. One is from a student perspective and one is from your perspective as educators. So Christina, if you would go to the next slide. The first thing I'd love to hear from in the chat is, how do you think students view success in your classes? So what does success look like to a student? Grades, yeah. An A, yeah. Praise, that's a great point. Yeah, another thing is work for their portfolio. Certainly, you know, I wanna put this together. I'm gonna have a great portfolio. I'm gonna get a job. So that's that kind of that sequence.
Elio just brought up a really good one. I learned a lot. I know InDesign and Photoshop, some sort of tangible thing that you can tell people you know. And do you find that that's difficult in design? Like, I know how to utilize contrast to illustrate my point. Like that's a little harder to understand, a little harder to grab onto for the student, but also harder for them to share.
It's funny, I see this sometimes most dishearteningly in our kind of like junior or senior level students. Maybe they get to the point that they're putting together a resume and they want to put some skills on there. That students, things like InDesign, Photoshop, After Effects software, it's very easy for them to articulate what their skills are. Things like critical thinking or maybe even research, things that we could call skills that they're learning in our classes, that they have a harder time identifying when those are happening and articulating them as skills or learning knowledge that they have gained. So, you know, I want to talk about this idea of grades and make a distinction between performance and learning. So performance is really just showing that you can do something. I think, you know, getting that A, getting a good grade, accomplishing a task. You know, I can maneuver easily through the Photoshop interface, let's say. That's performance. Learning, while grades can sometimes indicate learning, it's not always the case. So learning is really separate from performance. Performance is in the moment, I can show that I can do it. And I think students are maybe a lot more comfortable with that because it leads to some of the things that you all were talking about in the class, praise from their instructors, praise from each other, so those kind of like external validation feelings, whereas learning can be a very internal process, and sometimes comes along with feelings that don't feel very validating. So I'd love you to go to the next slide, Christina. And so I asked you how students evaluate their success. What does success look like to you in the classroom? So when do you feel like, okay, my students are getting it, the student is becoming successful? Engagement, yes. Seeing those feelings of confidence, independence, growth, yeah. And I have growth kind of in this presentation later, and it's something that I like to see and monitor in my classes. I'd love if anybody has any thoughts on how to quantify or like, what does growth look like? How can we identify growth?
Pick your brain on that, Sarah. Growth it sounds a little gross, actually. But how do you show that from beginning to end? I was thinking, what if you had, and I know Prescott and I talk about this a lot, is sort of evaluating themselves, that self-evaluation. Here's your first assignment from this class, and here is your last assignment from the class. Or maybe, does anyone do sort of a thing where you do like an exercise at the beginning and the same one at the end, and sort of let them look at it? Or what are your other kind of measurements for that? Gary raised his hand. Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and take a question. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that I do that I think is helpful is at the end of every class is what, I don't know if I made this up or someone told it to me, return to learn is what I call it. And so let's say you taught for an hour, the last like 3, 4, 5 minutes, I say, well, we've been chatting for an hour or so. Here's what we did. Didn't feel like we did that much, but here's all the stuff we did, right? So it's like a cool reflection at the end to remind them like, wow, there is a lot of value in what we just did, even though it felt like it went by quickly,
That's a really great ad. There's some really great stuff happening in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Rubrics that heavily weight the process from step 1 to the final project, maybe rather than looking just at the final product. That's a really good one.
Next slide. So there's a term called durable learning. It just means lasting learning, learning that sticks around outside of maybe the classroom environment or, an immediate exposure to a topic. So students who are invested in what they're learning, so they understand the value of it, they can connect it to what they know already, which if you're familiar with the term mental models, so like our mental models of things, that's their existing learning, and understand the value of what they're learning. So invested in the process and understanding the value of learning itself, but also what they're learning, retain content more effectively. So connecting this kind of metacognitive thinking about learning to the learning process helps students retain it more effectively. Next slide. Within this, I want to talk about 2 kinds of agency. So the first is kind of around what we've been talking about. Students feel invested in the topic and therefore in control of their learning. Even if they don't feel invested in the topic. I mean, how many of you have heard students say like, well, I don't really like this class or, whatever, I'm just here because I have to. But at least if they can understand the process of and the value of what's being learned in the class, connected to, a later goal, they're going to feel more in control. And then the other thing I want to talk about is students having control over their time, their effort, so what they're putting into the class, and any decisions about that. Next slide. So the first one, looking at control over their learning. So in language they connect with, right? So thinking about, what I was talking about with Gen Z, and that they're very career motivated, security motivated, and job money equals security for this generation. So demonstrating that the course has value, like how are the skills they're learning in this class going to help their career? So making those connections. How might they be personally enriched by the content? And although, maybe that doesn't speak to Gen Z as much, I think talking to your students about like how this will help you, how you will grow, how I'm seeing you grow can be really beneficial. So that leads into this idea of growth mindset. So growth mindset is just this idea of believing within yourself that you can change. So I can acquire new knowledge, I can acquire new skills, rather than thinking, my intelligence is fixed. Students with a fixed mindset maybe have heard all their lives, oh, you're so smart, oh, you're so talented, right? That actually kind of freezes the moment in time. So it's much more effective to praise students for their effort over their ability. So, you really put a lot of work into this project. Yes, math is like the example, right? And I catch myself saying stuff like this too in classes, and I have to remember to correct myself about myself. But to just praise and reward effort, because if students think their ability to learn is fixed, why would they take ownership of their learning? If they think they can't do it. And then the last thing is to talk to students about the learning process. In general, people want learning to feel easy. And students, when they feel like their learning is easy, they feel more rewarded. But really, sometimes the learning process, think about anything you've learned recently, that really takes time and struggle. So now I have a question for you all. Getting into that value of learning, how do you help students see this? What are you all doing in the classroom to help students see the value of what they're learning? Lisa, I like that.
Lisa, I do the same exact thing when I'm teaching code. This is madness. If you've reached the point where you don't know where you overwrote your CSS, know that is CSS. You got it. You can overwrite it, which is amazing, but also terrifying. And so if you're struggling, like, I'm sorry, but you're right where you're supposed to be. You're going to break through any minute. Just sort of validation. I feel like that validation really helps. Don't you think, Sarah?
Yes. Yeah. Especially that in the moment with things like, anybody in this meeting that teaches HTML or CSS knows that one is a real hill to climb with students. I think connecting things to professional practice. I'm hearing, I think in all the sessions I've attended, a lot of content around recaps and reflections, which is, I feel like I want to integrate more into my teaching. So then the other bit of agency I want to talk about is, if you could go to the next slide, Christina, is control over time and effort. And I think this one feels less natural to us, but it's just as important. Think of all the reasons your students might feel a lack of control in their lives, not necessarily in your classroom, but in their lives. Somebody is dictating their work schedule. They might not have control over where they live or who they're living with. They might not feel like they have an ability to move freely within society. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, does our classroom and the way we run our classroom reinforce these feelings that maybe students are getting from a cultural or societal standpoint? So I think just realizing that your students may feel a lot of lack of control outside of the classroom is a great place to start. Now, bringing some of that control into the classroom, these can be little interventions to let students feel like they're more in control. So giving them a say in classroom policies, due dates on assignments, assignment topics, what software or tools they're using to complete the assignment, and even what effort or investment they're putting into assignment. So last spring, I gave my students an opportunity to kind of choose how much they did on a project, so they could do kind of like less work and go for a max grade of a B, or they could do the project as written and their max grade would be an A. So, you know, it wasn't guaranteeing that grade, but just giving them that choice allowed them to feel like, okay, I have limited resources. This is where, you know, I think we felt a lot of this happening during COVID. So much is out of everybody's control. So, you know, where can we give students back some of that control? And then, you know, another thing, I think this came up in the chat a lot with grading. So sharing your rubrics ahead of time, being transparent about grading, so students feel like they have control over what they're putting into an assignment, what they're doing, what they're not doing. You know, some students will kind of do the math on a grade and figure out what they might skip and what they might not. So, you know, any of this like growth language and flexibility we're using, just see if there are ways you can reinforce that with the currency of the classroom, and that currency is grading. So last question is that we prescribe a lot in our classes. We have a lot of control. So in order to give students more agency and feel like they're in control, where can we kind of open those things up?
This is such a great question. I feel like one of the first ways I've seen this was more meant to be tricky, like just like fool the students into making their own mind up. But on day one, I had professors ask, well, you know, what about attendance? What do you think the attendance policy should be? And on day one, they're all like, well, you know, you should get points for being here. And then, you know, if you told them that, hey, points are worth, attendance is worth points, they're like, this is terrible. But if they chose it on their own, then they're like, ooh, why did we do that? And I feel like it was more in a tricky way, but I do think that was like one step into giving them agency. This is your class. What do you think? But I'd love to hear these new ideas of how you can kind of give the students their agency. Like you're making your choices without making our lives harder.
Yeah. And like small places, you know, I'm not giving the reins over to students completely, you know, trusting our expertise. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. But, you know,
Jonathan
students...
says develop your own process timelines. We're going to talk about due dates with Hugo in just a little bit. They present a calendar to you, Diane. That's awesome. Oh, like, here's good. What my milestones are going to be for an assignment or for a project.
I love this question. How often do you think I'm allowed to be absent? And I think that means as a professor before you would want a tuition refund. That's a great way to kind of flip it back to students. So the next slide. So I'm going to give you, you can screenshot this. Maybe I could copy and paste it and put it in the chat, but these concepts are just a place to get started. I think what I'm advocating for here doesn't have to be a change to curriculum. So, and sometimes just the way you talk to students about how they're learning, the classroom environment, that processing can do a lot to influence their thinking about learning. So just getting students thinking about that, you know, as we've seen some of you using with writing prompts and in-class discussion and activity, these are all means to, you know, let students feel like they're more in control. So I've used many of these in classes, and, you know, they provide thought-provoking discussions. So I just wanted to, the last slide is just to share kind of sources and a lot of thinking around this. There is one thing I wanted to share with you all. I will put it in the chat here. This is a post I saw. It was a post on Instagram that compiled a Twitter thread from someone, an educator during the pandemic. And I just, it doesn't completely relate to agency, but I think the way she's thinking about giving her students more control and just adapting courses to acknowledge the whole person was really revolutionary to me. So there's that in the chat, and that's everything.
Thank you, Sarah. These are a lot of, and just so you know, I will go ahead and take the presentation and all the sources, and I'll make it available in the Slack channel for you all after this. So you don't have to screenshot or frantically copy and paste all of these things. But student agency is one of these things that that I feel like just in the last year, we've really started practicing in our classrooms, something we've certainly been aware of, but something especially in the pandemic has become so important that you kind of take control for yourself, and that is actually helping them in so many other ways than just their work. And so we're actually going to continue talking about agency and awareness. And I think that is this other end of it. How can I be aware of what's happening? What's my milestones ahead of me? What I need to get done in the rest of this day or week or this semester in order to be successful. So agency and awareness. And I would like to introduce Vinicius Lima, Associate Professor from Grand Valley State University. Vinicius.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation as well. I think, like Christina pointed out, a lot of our presentations, there's a lot of commonalities to it. I'm Vinicius, I'm from Grand Valley State University. I do have to acknowledge a few things here. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm not an educational theorist. So I, like most of folks who actually are educators now, have been learning how to become a better educator on the job. Like it's really important that to me, that I acknowledge this. There are experts, and like I rely on them very actively. I teach in a teaching focused institution, mostly undergraduates as well. And I do have a big privilege compared to some, because our program does require our students to consider taking classes in graphic design through a selective process. So it's a little bit different than when the student is just taking a class because they think it's cool. So, so just wanted to make these acknowledgements ahead of time. So I wanted, like Sarah started, I wanted to start with this question, like what adjectives would you use to describe a student who shows agency in their learning? So if you could put them in the chat. Proactive, excitement, confident, invested. Great, great. Encouragement of other students, on fire, motivated, playful. Great. So autonomous, confident, curious, mature, aware, responsible. These are all lovely descriptions. And but as you keep thinking of it, these are very active traits. These have to be, the student has to take ownership of them. And in the way, if we go to the next slide, Christina, please. So if we look at the definition of what a professor is and the common terms, and we look at the third item there that I highlighted, like one that teaches our professors. So special knowledge of an art or skill and everything. So in a way, this definition that we see of what a professor is almost makes students think that they're empty vessels and we just pour knowledge into them. And this is becoming even more prevalent. We're being asked over and over to address other skill demands in the classroom. Like curriculum has ballooned over the years. Like we have, like, you go on Twitter and there's all of these companies asking how the design students aren't prepared for the job anymore. They're missing this and this and this. And at the same time, we face pressure of our institutions to address, and rightfully so, structural inequalities and biases. And we have to empower, and most institutions have in their mission statements, they're here to empower students and transform them into active members of society. And most importantly, no pressure, but we usually have 4 years to do this. Sometimes we have less. So I just wanted to acknowledge this. It's like the main idea is we have to do all of this, but we also have to realize that this is not a superpower that we have as professors.
Vinicius, I have a question for you real quick.
Yes.
This isn't so important for us to realize that, you know, what all it is we do. But I feel like students, and I know that students don't understand this distinction at all, that as educators, oddly, we are not actually trained in education. We are experts at a thing, right? A profession, especially I think in terms of design, where we know that you don't need a degree to do what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tell students that I am not educated as an educator, I am not a teacher in that way, I think it blows their mind.
Oh, okay. I haven't really tried that. Actually, probably out of fear, because I know the evaluations will be coming later. And and I don't know, I fear that one of them is going to say, is like, he told us he doesn't know how to teach. Yeah, so, but I think that's a really good point. I think the vulnerability that you're showing to coming forward to the students, that like teaching is a collaborative effort and we all learn together is really important to actually create that relationship with them as you're going.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So if we go to the next slide. So as I was talking about this idea, like we don't have this superpower to transform our students completely in such a limited time frame. It's important, but we do have the power of working with them rather than working for them. So when we think about this, we sort of we acknowledge what they're bringing into the classroom, like Sarah pointed out, and we tailor our teaching to make sure that we're helping them succeed. So if we could go to the next slide here, it's a question. So it's like, and then we face challenges as well. So like, as we think about tailoring our teaching to every single student, my question to you all is, so what challenges do we face when we're fostering these experiences in our classes? Could you put it in the chat? Can't please everyone. Yes. Yes. Apathy. Yes. The almighty grades. Yes. Being perceived as disorganized. Absolutely. The expectation to feed the content. Yes. Students wanting to be passive, not setting high enough goals. Great. Yes. There's a lot of those, a lot of demanding too much investment. Absolutely. There's also other things like Sarah already pointed out, like the transition from high school to college for some could be a challenge. It's like they're moving from a period when they had everything sort of standardized for them. They standardized testing, the schedules were controlled to the minute. They had expectations of assigned monitor tasks. They've had expectations of the right answers because they were being tasked on them later. So we always get these questions like, what do you want me to do so I can get an A? And things, or sometimes you even get questions like, if those of you who are actual advisors of the students that teach their classes, like I get this all the time. I get students in my office, they ask me like, which electives should I take? that defeats the entire purpose. It's they have to discover and they have to take ownership of their learning somehow. There's also temporary, like I would like to call this, like there's some of these barriers are more permanent than others, but when you think sometimes the agency of the student gets affected by momentary things, like last year, the pandemic did affect the student's agency in a lot of ways. The cost of education could affect students' agency, other permanent or temporary life events, the fact that the student doesn't feel welcome in the classroom because of gender, sexuality, language barriers. So all of these things can be very difficult to deal with from a student perspective, and still being asked to take over their learning somehow. So, so what I wanted to say here today is like this idea that developing agency is a lot about having a sense of awareness, and have you as a professor of awareness of your students, but also of the student having awareness about themselves. So if we go to the next slide, Christina, I have this message from two authors, and that was really resonated with me. There's the internal awareness of themselves, and it's like their ideas, talents, perspectives, and impulses. And there's the external awareness of what is happening around them. So what are the others are doing, where they fit in with them, and how they can contribute without losing connection to themselves. And this message, as I was preparing this talk, was really resonated with me, because this idea of awareness is good because it doesn't imply that agency is something the students never had. Like it's something that sometimes like it probably got removed from them for various circumstances, and it's our choice as students, as our task as professors, as educators, to have them be aware that they can seize this opportunity and gain control on and act on a decision that can affect their lives. So it's about making sure that they take some of the responsibilities and some of the, and understand what they're setting themselves up for. It's a big change for them. Like we talked about, they've had a lot of things prescribed for them. Even the university has a lot of structural things prescribed for them. You have to have so many classes here, so many classes there. So working with the students and understanding that is, I think, is our biggest challenge towards student agency. So if we can go to the next slide, I have some methods here that we think are useful to raise agency awareness. So the first thing is acknowledging it. So when you actually see it, that the student took agency upon their learning, do reinforce it to them. It's like they may not notice that they did it. And it's if you identify, like, let them know. It's like, this was really good that you took control over this. I had this in class the other day, a student who decided to explore a totally different process for their project. And it was out of the blue, and it was wonderful to watch. Other things like the idea of having contracts, or like when you have any types of contracts, grading contracts, syllabus contracts, attendance, and everything.
I'd actually like to pick your brain more about this class contracts, because a couple of people have mentioned it in the chat. And so you can kind of write in the chat what your contract is. And Vinicius, if you have kind of an example of that, do you mean like a syllabus contract, or like a goals contract? I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. We do have to have some prescribed policies that are department-wide. So there are some things we cannot deviate from, and then we have to follow suit. But there are things that are like the moments when we feel like we can give the student back the opportunity to voice their opinion. That's when we can really have a good contract. I have contracts with my students in regards to responding to work and to responding to others' work. So what are the expectations in terms of critiques, in terms of assessing, in terms of giving each other feedback. And
Diane just wrote in the chat, what if they make a contract with themselves? I love that. what am I going to do this year,
Yeah.
this semester? Ooh.
Yeah. And they do make, in our senior thesis, our students do make a quote unquote contract because they have to assemble a proposal essentially for their projects that defines the goals for themselves. They define their timelines, and I just manage them essentially with that project. So
I love it.
yeah. The idea of reaffirming their identities, so connecting what they're learning to their personal experiences, making sure that you're offering choice over content when possible and process, and knowing their ambitions and their intentions. It's that they are going through this curriculum that is prescribed for them in a lot of cases, but they all gonna resonate with different moments of it. So when you decide, when you identify that they're resonating with it, making sure that you're fostering that even further. The idea of pre-assessment, so having them recall what they already know, like they coming in with a lot of knowledge from other classes. So ask them, what do they know about things? The most important is like peer-to-peer interactions, group projects. Those are great if you want to see the students exercising their leadership skills. I know they're very frightening in some cases and in some classes, but it's really an important experience to see them growing and exercising their ability to collaborate. The most important thing here to me is this idea of fostering a mistake-safe environment. So as we're facing a generation that's really prone to just looking for the right answers, how do we make sure that we model that behavior, that we're human and we can make mistakes and we're learning from them just as much. So like, not being a perfect teacher is one way, like having moments of mistakes in the classroom, acknowledging them, it's also great as well. De-emphasizing grading is good. Like they will have to have grades because most institutions do require grades, but also having less emphasis in it. Like, and I know this is easier said than done, but as I've seen some of my students, I teach this a similar group of students in multiple classes too, so which is great. But I've seen them growing into this, like they start the program with a very small, with a very close attachment to their grades, but they end up the program really thinking more about what they've learned and not really paying much attention to that little letter. Project reviews are really good to emphasize their awareness of their learning because they can really assess what they had made wrong, essentially, or what they could have improved upon. The setting goals, advising is great. Being a model of all of these behaviors, like understanding where you are exercising your own agency over your classes, and really really offering skills, training skills on that. That's also good. And the last one that I really want to focus on today, which is the one I believe the most, and it's one I practice a lot, is the idea of reflection. So when we go to the next slide here, so Christina, oh, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I'm a firm believer on the power of reflection as this for students. And there's these two types of reflections, the reflection in action and the reflection on action. So the reflection in action is essentially what they're doing every day. So as they're working through a project and they have to decide and make different variations, that's reflection in action right then and there. They're actively working on something and they're making decisions on the fly. And they're very comfortable with this. Like they're trying different ideas, making different sketches, and so on and so forth. The reflection on action, on the other hand, is a little bit harder because, and it's sometimes overlooked. And I was one of them that used to overlook these things. And it happens, sometimes it happens too late in the process. It's very personal. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to look back. So if we go to the next slide for a second here. The next slide. All right, so this is like that. I'm gonna share a story. This was my class, essentially. Like I would present the typical design class that I used to teach. It was being a project culminates with critiques. In the meantime, I would have check-ins with them and everything, and they would just go with the motion of it. And all of a sudden, I started noticing that my students weren't even picking up even though the projects were scaffolded into one another, my students weren't picking up that the skills they were using in project 3 were already covered in project 1. And they were always like trying to relearn things and try to reinvent the wheel. And this would happen in the first classes, between the class, and it would also happen between the first class and their third class. So in the first class, for example, I don't know, we teach a typography course, and then by the time they got to a publication layout later on, a year later, they were telling me they didn't know how to handle bodies of text, and I would have to or pair the text with the image. I was like, well, you did do that assignment in graphic design 1 2 semesters ago. So like, what are some of the things you can bring back from that? So I changed to the next slide here. I changed my approach a little bit to include a reflective moment before the critique. And I think that's important because to happen before the critique, because it would make them think about the process more rather than the final artifact of that they were presenting to the class. The critique has already that dynamic of everyone is showing their work, everyone is very vulnerable. So like having a moment of reflection but after that could be a little bit difficult for me. But I wasn't very good at first asking about critiques. I would ask just a basic question. What do you think of the project? And that was the most horrible question you can ask a student, right? Because that's essentially a very open-ended question. It would give you, and the answers that I would get were almost like, oh, I hate that the printer didn't print correctly, or I had my computer broke, or things like that. There was nothing really about the learning. So I went back to my teaching training and I started to looking for more ways of addressing reflection practices with my students. And last year we went online. I was teaching fully online, half synchronous and half asynchronous. Essentially, they would meet once a week with me. And that's when these reflections became really important because I wasn't seeing them as much in the classroom and I wasn't noticing their growth as much. So I created these 2 options. Those are 2 Google Forms. Essentially, that was the method I use. And there are questions here that would just indicate that. And in the next slide, there's also a semester reflection. And that was one of the first things that I implemented. My main goal with all of these is essentially to not talk about design. I think they have a lot of opportunity to discuss design in critiques and within the class. I think this is about the experience of learning. And so we talk about the challenges, we talk about the positive moments, the positive interactions they had, and we elaborate on this. And so I wanted to have the next slide, which is a question for everyone, which is essentially like, if you're a big for someone who does reflect, like, what do you do in your classes? And that's reflection to the assignment. Okay. Reflection sheet after each project. Good. Okay. Reflection quiz. So that's nice. Love to hear that. Okay. Process document. Okay. Yeah. Self-reflections. Great. Great. Cool. A mid-semester evaluation. A reflective plot. Great. All right, cool. So Christina, can we go to the next slide quick? So here's some of the things that I've done with my students, like as I go through this this journey of like trying different things in terms of reflection. I think it's important to vary the method that you're using, just so it doesn't become busy work for the students. We all know we're dealing with much shorter attention spans also now. So like defining the goal of the reflection and then choosing the proper method is very important. So sometimes I just ask the 3-2-1, like 3 things they learned, 2 things they would like to learn more, and 1 thing they still need to learn. And sometimes we do a full portfolio assessment at their junior level. We have a student review of their work, and we just assess the entire progress in the program so far. So if we go to the next slide here, Christina. So here are some benefits that I've observed, like the ability of them taking role in internalizing their knowledge. It's like they're really thinking about what they have learned in the classroom from a different perspective beyond design. And I think that's what's really important because it transfers from the design classroom to the others disciplines. They also embrace a perspective of growth, which Sarah talked a lot about in her presentation, and they can identify how they exist in the classroom community. They start identifying like, what is their place in that small group? Where do they lie? Where do they work? How do they work with everyone? There's also other benefits in the next slide. Here, can we go?
Did it change? No?
Yeah, they do. So they start also to think about individual approaches to their practice. They start to identify how their acquired knowledge can apply to different complex settings. They allow students to process failure and learn from it. I think that's a really big thing if you're a learner, is to understand that not everything is going to be smooth, but you should have a way to overcome that and make
Such a great point. And I know Hugo is about to talk about that. How do we talk about failure? And so, because that's also super important.
Yeah. So my next slide is just my sources, and thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Vinicius. So much great chat happening here. I will capture that chat as well as some of the sources y'all have come up with and shared with us. If you give me permission, I would love to include that. And I'll of course post all of that to the Slack channel. So thanks for that. So as we're thinking of this topic of agency and awareness for our students, we're preparing them for so much more than just being successful students. We're helping them be successful, I think, in their lives as well, because they transfer these great thoughts and processes into, hopefully they do, to the other things that they do within their life. And there's been so many great suggestions. I will capture all of this stuff from the chat for sure and put it all together in a nice list, because I think there are so many new tips and tricks that we can use to make our students more successful, or to help lead them to success. And that leads us to due dates. I have so many thoughts on this, including my very controversial no more due dates. Only milestones.
Nice.
But I'll add my thoughts as they are applicable. But welcome, Hugo Escalante Almazan, Professor Tecnológico de Monterrey. Hugo, welcome. Let's hear about
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here with you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Lisa, Sarah, Vinicius. It's a great opportunity to just let all of that steam out of a whole year being on this screen. And that's what I'm gonna talk about. I'm gonna talk about time. Even though we have a little bit of time, I'm gonna talk about time. And the first thing I want to do is ask you, how late is it too late for you for an assignment to be delivered? Because I've had some students deliver me the assignment from the first week attempting to get a grade. So, and we've been like into this situation where we have to be like permissive of this. Like, we need to be patient. We are told from our institutions, from our governments, to be flexible. So how much of this flexibility can we afford? How much flexible are we gonna be with the student that wants to do the semester's worth of work in the last week? How do you think it's gonna play out some? So let me check out the chat. Like 1 week. Okay, that's in the syllabus. That's a good idea. 3 days, the weekend, 1 week. So we're talking 4 business days.
A lot of variance here in terms of what's acceptable to each professor.
Exactly, like we all have different. I mean, it even depends on what students' situation might be, right? Oh, there's a big one. Deadlines must be observed. Okay. So
It
we
used
have
to very much be, this is the deadline. You're a designer. If you're working with your client and you turn it in
of
late,
course.
gone. And pandemic has totally changed my mind on that.
Exactly. And can we go to the next slide, please? That's exactly the point. Like we're talking about time, right? So now our time is really different. Our time is constantly being watched, constantly being monitored, controlled even, not only children, adults, students and teachers. Everyone is on this vortex where we are constantly being watched upon. As teachers, as students, we have to make work, right? We have to work. We have to do the things that they pay us for, and the students have to do the things they signed up for. So, how is this changing our ability to find success in this in assignments, for example? So after considering a lot of variables, like this question I asked you before, like, well, if a student takes 3 weeks to deliver one homework, one piece of work, and I still have to take it in because the rules allow it to, how are we gonna change this? How are we gonna rethink an assignment? How do we rethink what we are doing in the classroom? And that's the next. I'm skipping because I have time upon it. So how do we rethink assessments? How do we push the students without bordering them into a crisis? I mean, it's not only my class. Over here we have about 50 teachers. Everyone has a class, and an average student gets what, 6 to 8 classes? So it's 6 people watching over you, 6 people controlling what you should do, 6 people telling you what to do, and everyone asks for a different kind of result. So how do we rethink this? How do we manage with all of these variables? And even so, can we switch to the next one, please? How do we cope with expectation? We have technology. Of course, we're relying on technology. We have relied on technology for a long, long time, but especially now in these days, we have relied so much on this technology. We have been making an utmost effort to have the classroom as we know it, as we used to go, in a virtual setting. And that is really, really complex, since we know every student is different. Everyone learns from a different situation. They learn on different time periods. They have different situations going on in their mind. you don't even have to worry about the student being there, because you see the camera off, or he can put a video on it and you don't even know if it's the person's there. So how do we manage the expectations? How do we, as teachers, level this up? Like, I know we need technology. I know we need to be on these hybrid models and these new super omnipresential models. But what do we do to encourage our students, to have that agency we'd be talking about during the course of this speech? So that's one point. And what we've done, or what we've come up with, is a kind of a block class. What a block is a 5-week program. A 5-week program in which we develop a project during those 5 weeks. Why do we do this? Because we believe that most of the students, or most of our students, or we noticed that they don't take steps forward on their learning abilities. So we decided that you don't need all of the data. Most students feel like they need every information, to master the software, to master the research, to master everything before they even start a project. And we try to keep that off, like to empower them in some sort of way, that you have to start right away with the project, and you move as quickly as possible through the data, through the research, through the prototypes, so you get a full-blown project in 5 weeks. And that's that also centers their attention on the important things, so they don't have the time to focus or to get out of this state of mind, of the designing state of mind, which sometimes they just slip out of the slipstream. So now we have this shortened blocks. We get 3 blocks a semester, well, like 15 weeks, and we leave the last week for a reflection week. They have a whole week in which they talk to their teachers, they talk to their to their peers of what they have learned, of what they have done. And we even connect them with people outside the university, with real businesses, so they can really, from the first semester, attest or assess all of what they have learned. So that's how we've coped with this situation during these times. So can we go to the next one? I'm trying to go as fast as I can. I'm sorry if I get kind of stuck.
You're doing great, and you have plenty of time, so relax.
Thank you. Let me drink some water while I ask you this question. Now, we've talked about success and what success means, but can we and should we evaluate failures, given that failures are the cornerstone of success? How can we do that on the classroom?
I think evaluating failure might be just as much as success. Why? And maybe you wrap that into that reflection, right? If you didn't find this successful, why did it fail? And how can you turn that into a success? It's really reframing the same thing. Do you think?
Yes, of course. It's you can't separate, like yin yang, right? You gotta have the one to acknowledge the other one. So yeah, what I mean by failure is by making failure the mainstream at our university, at the class, right? Like failure is the new success. Failure is the new black. Like we could potentially see an uprising of agency if we nurture that failure, because it's a bubble, right? We work on a very different bubbles, and I'm going to talk about that more later. But we do live on this tiny bubbles where failure could be the expectation. And yeah, I see that the institutions don't take nice at that. Yeah, that's one of the great points of this. Institutions rely on numbers, and numbers and failure don't go hand in hand. But maybe we could change that on our classrooms by giving them this contract to the students. Like, you know what? In this space, we're gonna measure failure, because you're gonna learn more from failure, from the real world, or in your real world activities than being a straight A students. You are straight A students, you're good, but maybe some students need to learn from this failure. And for us teachers to be receptive of that, to rethink this academic rigor, this grit, the resilience, all this institution-based thoughts that we might just pass on to them, that might be a shackle to some of them. I'm not generally speaking, but some of them are shackled to that. Like, I can't do this. Like, I saw some of the comments like, I can't draw, I can't design because I can't draw. I don't know how to draw. Even to this day, I practice, but I don't know how to draw. And it's not something that defines me as a designer. So we have to nurture that feeling. We have to be patient, and that's when time gets real tricky. So we have to be patient, but we have 4 years to.
Hugo, I love that. And I think one of the things I've heard many design educators share over the years, and certainly in these sessions, is how do you get over? That's the biggest thing. Students are like, oh, but I can't draw. And I'm like, yeah,
Exactly.
but I can't either. And so on day one, I asked them to draw a cat. And then I show them my drawing of a cat, which is barely a cat. But then we make that a learning moment. All right. But did you know it's a cat? What were the things about the cat that made you know? Is it the whiskers? If I just do whiskers, is that enough? Well, now I've sent you a design, haven't you? It's a cat. So I think if we can show them, and that's one of the things we've mentioned a lot throughout this chat, is if you show them as a teacher that failure is okay, that failure is where we learn from that, then they feel connected. They feel like they fit in. They feel like they're on your level. Such a great observation.
Yeah. So, well, we can go to the next one, please. So if we evaluate failure, imagine most of us are constantly on the verge of breaking out because we have too many things to do, right? You get sent, how many institutional emails do you receive a day? How many? Like
hundreds,
10 on a good day, 10. Yeah. So and we have to be nice with the institution. We have to be nice with the students. We have to be nice with our families. So Chichek here, a philosopher, he tells us, imagine the strain of constantly being nice. And I think that's one of the overall pandemic situations that has gotten into not only our heads, but the students' heads and their families' heads, that we have to be nice or be okay every single time. And I understand, I put this on the due dates theme because it affects our view of time. Being nice, time goes fast, right? But how long will this pandemic still be on? What's the due date on the pandemic? What's the due date on this situation? What's the due date on virtual learning? So we have no idea. We can't control that. And that's are we ready for the next pandemic? It will come sometime, right? We don't have to rely. Do we rely on the same tools that we have relied school upon like 100 years ago, or the last year? Do we use that as a measure? So that's why I'm not, or what I consider not only success, but failure. You know, the failure of seeing what students need, what we need as people. And that comes, this is a number I chose from the recent news in my country. So imagine you have this 4 years to become a professional, and then you come out of the school and you notice that your GDP, or the GDP in my country, has gone negative 19%. That's a 5-year, we're talking about time still, that's a 5-year backwards economic growth. And we will recover from this in 5 more years. So that's an overall 10 years that we have lost in a vortex during 1 year in the real world, not just in the classroom. That's what our students are going to go outside and look for a job and find themselves into this vortex, into this new reality. That's our new reality. That's the new normal, if there ever was something like that. So what strategies are you using, or are we using, to prevent burnout? This all creates burnout. This time creates burnout. And mostly burnout is about time. It's about lost time. It's about time we spend on a screen. It's about time we spend on a book, and it's time not spent with our families. Same as happens to the students. So how are we preventing this? Anyone has some idea, or what have you done with students that prevents them from burning out? Life happens, yeah, of course, guys. Too much assessments, yeah. Pet projects, yes. Work. Mid-semester break, days off, guest lectures, yeah. Change of pace is fantastic. Change of pace is actually what I'm gonna talk about. So we can, for my students, give you more or less projects. Yeah, less projects, and that's just my whole point. Like, we do not need to replicate the traditional classroom as much as I'm sorry, but as much as our institutions love this to happen, it cannot happen. It will not happen. We are the pioneers in a new frontier. We are the ones paving the way for that next pandemic, and it's up to us not to repeat those same mistakes. That's the failure. The failure to have the same strategies, the same speeches, the same materials. We all in this room, we all changed that. We all shifted that through our practice, and that's what I think we need to do to create a new classroom. The new classroom. How will we teach design in the next 10 years? In the next 15 years? How will AI becoming a designer affect our teaching methods and the real life out there? How about AI designing posters or AI designing objects? We're screwed. So how do we focus that? How do we shift that? And that's something I want to address in the next slide, please. Because that's how we've been doing it, even at this time, right? You need to do something, you stress about it, but how do you get unstressed? Just do the thing, and it's gonna cost you tears. You're gonna suffer about it, but that's the only way we've known, right? We've done this since we were a little kid. Like, how do you cope with this? Well, how do you cope with stress? Well, do this. So how can we avoid these kind of thoughts, these kind of situations? And with, I think there is an even bigger shift on this. Can we see the next one, please? So what we do, or what I do, or what I try to do, is to focus on culture. Not just on the technical side of it, not just in the software, not just on the facts. I mean, not the facts, that the technical stuff, and the very specific stuff, but in culture. So what you do when you teach a designer to look upon other cultures different as theirs, is that they begin to see the world in a different scope, and they begin to see it as a series of interactions and experiences, rather than just one object or one typography or one. You start to think in terms of people, and we are just here for the people to think through in the form of empathy, right? We create empathy when we do stop and reflect. How do I mean? What do I mean by stop and reflecting? Sometimes what I do is we stop the class. Like when it's overwhelming, when it's when the students are, you see their faces, you see their development, you see they're having challenge with some sort of task. I stop the class and I just tell them that they need to read some comics, to watch a movie, and to regenerate, because it's important for us, for them, to sometimes just stop what we didn't do. We just we were on the fly making changes, like we've been a whole year making changes, adapting, reading news, and now, well, we gotta stop sometime and reflect, and then do it again. Like all the great tips we've heard today. So that's the whole point. I think that we need to signify what we can do in the classroom, and that will take a long time. But if we start now, we will be ready for the next 10, 20 years. So that's what I have to say about the topic.
Hugo, I love your idea of this new frontier for education and stopping and reflecting and looking at when you're overwhelmed and doing something else. And you're right, it will lead into the next 10 years or 15 years, because that school culture, that education culture of taking a break when you're overwhelmed and breaking it down and doing the best you can and doing the best for you and your education is going to lead into the workforce, and the workforce isn't going to be is going to benefit from that new frontier. And a couple of y'all have mentioned kind of that hustle culture and this whole the whole just reimagining what work is, and the work-life balance right now is so important. But we got to start it in education. We've got to be the one that recognizes, oh, you're overwhelmed, then let's stop and let's take this step by step, and let's make sure we're taking care of our mental health. Lisa, yes. That way they bring that into the work culture, so it's not this overwhelming thing that it is right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's mental health is the main topic of I think of all the themes we saw today. I think mental health is like the thread that holds them all together.
It really is. That first and foremost, we're humans. I think Gary said this earlier, kind of pull back the curtain and show the humanity. We're not these, robots teaching them. We are humans as well. And I think that's one of the things the pandemic has shifted for us into this new school environment. We're not going to go back to what it is, because that would be going backwards. We wouldn't be
Exactly.
progressing forward. We can't ignore the great things that we learned and the mistakes that we've made and progress and not progress with them. We have to progress because it's the right thing to do. It was maybe the right thing to do all along, to stop when you're overwhelmed. It was probably the right thing all along to not go to school when you're sick. It
Exactly.
was probably our responsibility to show that it's not okay to go to school when you're sick, not because you're going to infect other people, although yes, but it's because you need to support you. You need to stay home and get better. And if we can show them in that classroom and we can and say it here and change and make that new frontier. I think we've already coined the phrase Nuevo Frontier.
Frontier.
Fronteria. See?
Frontera.
Frontera, Nueva Frontera. We can move that into the work culture as well, and we can start to change that culture as well.
Yes, exactly.
I want to thank y'all so much, each and every one of you. Amazing panelists. Hugo, Sarah, Vinicius, thank you so much for being here and indulging really just my need to hear y'all speak and give me great ideas, of which I definitely have gotten. And so many great ideas shared in the chat. I am capturing that as we speak right now so that I can integrate all that in together. And of course, thank you so much to the DEC for putting this together. Lisa, amazing girl, and Alberto and Mina and all of those that are helping putting this together and letting this amazing community be together and support each other. Thank you so much for everything you do there.
Well, thank you, Christina, and for moderating this. And I love, love, love how interactive this session was. It was such a nice change. I've loved every session in ShiftED, right? Don't get me wrong, but it was just really nice, right? To see how we could all kind of contribute throughout the whole session and sort of be having that more active discussion in that space. So I very much appreciate you and the panelists for framing your session that way. So we are at the end of time, but if you have questions and things for these amazing panelists, please do remember you can connect with them in the chat. And then also, I'm sure they'd be happy for you to reach out to them. These are also themes that we can take into the next session that's going to be happening in about an hour and a half. Lisa Hammershame is going to be doing a listening session, right? So she's going to frame it in her own way, but we're going to be able to talk about some of these things, I think, in that space, specifically about online teaching. So you can kind of put a pin in some of those, and I think we can continue the discussion in that session. So that is coming up at in about an hour and a half from now. So please do come join us for that. And then don't forget at 7 p.m. tonight Eastern time, so do the math in your head or look at the schedule. We are going to have another social mixer. This one's being hosted by Megan D and her friend and colleague, Jessica. This is too small, I can't read it.
Jessica Jacobs, who is now Jessica McMary.
Yes, thank you, Alberto. And they're going to be actually talking about, as the theme for the social mixer, design studios, student design studios, and how do you run those? So go check that out tonight if you can as well. And there's more content on Friday, so come join us for that as well. But for now, I'm just going to, again, let's give applause to our amazing panelists. This is, like I said, my brain's just on fire. I'm so pleased, I'm so happy. And you all go take a break and then come back in about an hour and a half and we can continue our discussion. So thanks, everybody.